Disney's Lilo and Stitch, brought to you by Capri Sun? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about Disney's 2025 sci-fi comedy remake, Lilo and Stitch. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and even some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Lilo and Stitch stars Maia, Kealoha, Sydney Agudong, and Zach Galifianakis, and was directed by Dean Fleischer Camp. It tells the story of a runaway alien genetic experiment who crash lands in Hawaii, befriending a young girl in search of friendship and belonging. Yep, we've got ourselves yet another Disney live-action remake dominated by CG characters. I could have sworn we were just talking about one of these not long ago. Oh wait. Well, we all know the deal with these live-action remakes at this point. They're typically big money makers that do well with families, but are usually derided by critics and the perpetually online. It's cool to hate these movies, especially if you haven't seen them, and so forth. You know the drill. These Disney remakes have been pretty hit or miss for me personally. I've genuinely liked some of them, and really disliked a few, but the vast majority have just been kind of for me. Fine, but ultimately forgettable. Regardless, I always give them a fair shot. Up until now, these films have been remaking Disney animated classics from the Golden Age to the Renaissance era, with the newest original film, chronologically speaking, being Mulan from 1998. I'll admit, it's been pretty weird seeing so many of the Renaissance era films I grew up watching getting the remake treatment. Certainly makes you feel old. But now we've finally made the leap to the post-Renaissance era, with the first live-action remake of a 2000s Disney movie. I was a bit older when Lilo and Stitch came out, but was definitely still a kid. And I enjoyed this weird little movie at the time, and still do, but it was never an all-time favorite of mine. I guess what I'm trying to say is I've got some nostalgia for it, but not any sort of overwhelming connection or affinity. To me, it was a film that seemed like a weird one to get the live-action treatment, especially given the obvious necessity for CG characters, but I wasn't opposed to the film's existence. Though having now seen it, I certainly question its existence a bit. When it comes to these remakes, people seem to be of two contradictory minds. In general, audiences want more of what they loved about the original movie, and yet not too much of it. These live-action films often get bashed for being shot-for-shot remakes, even when they're not actually, making them easy targets for those who oppose their very existence. But on the flip side, the remakes that have tried to change things up get torn apart for unnecessary deviations. In short, people want the illusion of something different. They want a remake that hits the same story beats, with the same tone, themes, and essence, but appears to be different, without actually being different. Obviously, this is a near impossible task, which is why people, including myself, always have plenty to complain about. This Lilo and Stitch remake tries to strike a balance between same and different, but perhaps expectedly, struggles. A lot is the same here, accounting for the irritated accusations of shot-for-shotism. I'm somebody who doesn't mind when we get some shot-for-shot moments in these remakes, because they were genuinely good moments the first time around too. But I have to say, those aspects of this film are handled strangely. It really feels like this movie's doing a speed run of the original's greatest hits, touching on all the classic moments and lines, but doing so without the impact or earned emotion. That said, this film does feature plenty of changes. Some of these changes are small and have no real impact on anything, other than to leave you asking why they bothered to make the change in the first place. I'm talking little but noticeable things, like the type of sandwich Lilo feeds to the fish, or swapping out the sunburned tourist with ice cream for a local islander with shave ice. Neither of these changes have any impact on the story whatsoever, but kind of stick out as unnecessarily sore thumbs to anybody who's seen the original. But what about the changes that do have a story impact? These kind of come in two different flavors. There's some changes that actually show some interesting potential, but are never really developed enough to ever become more than a plot convenience, or inconvenience. Most of these changes are related to Nani, and kind of flesh her out a bit more and make her feel like a real person beyond just the scope of the movie. Things like her surfing history and her marine biology aspirations. But then there are other changes, the majority of which are in the third act, that feel as though they were changed purely for the sake of change, maybe to avoid the accusations of shot for shotism. Change in and of itself wouldn't have been the worst thing in this scenario, so change isn't the issue here. It's that these changes add nothing to the story, the characters, the themes, and instead actually significantly detract from what the original film had to offer. Lilo and Stitch, both the original and this remake, possess an undeniably weird story. But one of the things that always grounded the original the most was its characters. I already mentioned how this remake changes things up a bit with its story, but I didn't mention, yet, that the bulk of this film's changes are actually character-based, or that very few, if any of them, are for the better. Let's start with Lilo and Stitch, who are arguably the characters that are most similar to their animated counterparts. Maia Kealoha is fine here as Lilo, pretty effectively capturing her spunky energy. But when we look beyond the performance to the actual characterization, this rendition of Lilo is far less weird. She's got some oddities, and still doesn't have any friends, but once we get past the first 10 minutes or so of the movie, she doesn't really feel like a weird, lonely misfit. So, her bond with Stitch feels very different in this remake. There's far less earned kinship there, so he feels more like just a pet in this one than he does a friend. Stitch himself is probably the highlight of this film. He was always a cute character, but giving him fur was a very smart move. Although the same cannot be said of all of the CGI in this film, Stitch's animation is really good here, and he truly lives up to his cute and fluffy line now. There's also some nice nostalgic consistency that comes from Chris Sanders reprising the vocal role. Stitch is still entertainingly chaotic, though maybe a bit less destructive, but probably partly because of the weirdness of his bond with Lilo here, there's somehow less characterization to him this time around, dampening the story's impact and emotion, despite the film's new contrived tearjerker moments. As I alluded to earlier, a character who does see some more characterization and fleshing out is Nani. Sydney Agudong gives probably the best performance in the film, nailing that blend of burnt-out stress and concern that an 18-year-old caring for her 6-year-old sister would understandably have. This rendition of the character is similar to the original Nani in many ways, but this time we get a glimpse of what her life could have been had her kuleana, her responsibility, not been required to shift to caring for Lilo. She's a bit more cynical here, especially with regard to the concept of ohana, which opens the door for some interesting character possibilities, which unfortunately don't end up going anywhere. Nani and Lilo still have some heartfelt moments and a good sisterly bond, but it does feel less integral here, largely due to the introduction of a new character, Tutu. She's their neighbor and grandmother of David, who kind of fills this babysitter, aunt, grandmotherly type of role, really decreasing the isolation and urgency of Lilo and Nani's situation when compared to the original. This changes the story and relationship dynamics, something that the new social worker does as well, though that character is played by Tia Carrere, the original voice of Nani, so that ends up making her okay. But when you add all of these character changes to the additional changes made to the characterization and story roles of both David and Cobra Bubbles, you really start to see their cumulative negative effects on the story. As you can see, there are a lot of noticeable and questionable changes in the characters in this remake, but we have still yet to talk about the character change with the biggest and most disappointing impact: the complete removal of Gantu. I'll admit, Gantu was never a favorite character of mine. I know he's got his fans, but to me, he was always a little generic as the big hulking antagonist. But as is now very evident, he had an undeniably important role in the story. He was a character that was single-mindedly focused on retrieving Stitch, neither caring about Stitch's well-being or Earth and its lowly inhabited species. This made him an actual threat, and obviously a big part of the action-filled finale. The lack of Gantu in the remake results in a far less imposing threat, and of course, some more character changes. I'm sad to say that Jumba and Pleakley are pretty disappointing here. Rather than retaining their alien forms while on Earth, they clone humans in an attempt to blend in. This saves on CG and makes the live action movie a bit more live action, I guess. Plus, there are some moments of resulting situational humor, but nothing any more entertaining than very obvious aliens doing the same things. Billy Magnussen is okay as Pleakley, a bit dumb, but manages to capture his energy. But Zach Galifianakis, on the other hand, feels very miscast as Jumba. The lack of accent shouldn't really make a difference, but it kinda does. And he also just doesn't capture the personality well. Even beyond his performance, the overall characterization changes made to Jumba as a result of Gantu's removal from the story were a major miscalculation. I won't spoil what happens, but again, these alterations significantly change both the character and story dynamics for the worse. For such a weird and crazy story, Lilo and Stitch was an animated film that managed to ground itself in its heartfelt and relatable themes. It was a story of ohana, of finding belonging, even if you were weird or different. Some of these found family ohana ideas remain in the remake, even if only within those fast-forwarded greatest hits moments. But bizarrely, another theme actually comes to the forefront and takes center stage instead. It's one that was present, but comparatively minimal in the original movie. The idea that doing a bad thing doesn't automatically make you a bad person, or alien. It's an important lesson, and a commendable theme for sure, but one that feels far less rooted in the core story than Ohana does. This isn't a film completely devoid of heart, but it's severely lacking on that front when compared to the animated film. It takes all of the original's rough or weird or emotional edges and sands them down into a smooth, normalized, easy to digest piece of family entertainment. That genuine warmth exuded by the original film is instead replaced by something that feels much more manufactured. Lilo and Stitch 2025 is an odd film. It'll be fine as mediocre standalone family entertainment, but will be immensely disappointing to anybody who has the basis to compare it to the animated film. If Disney's gonna keep remaking the movies that millennials grew up watching and are still attached to, then their strategy has to shift to something that'll appeal to not only those 30 and 40-something-year-old millennials, but also to their kids that some of them are gonna be bringing to the movies. For some reason, Disney hasn't quite cracked that code yet, but if they ever do, they could go a long way in turning around opinions on this whole live-action remake thing. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is definitely Stitch. His personality and bond with Lilo could have used a bit of work here, but I'm very happy to say that he looks great. The prevalence of CGI in these live-action remakes is its own issue, but Stitch mostly fits into the live-action world, and looks undeniably cute doing so. Stitch was always cute, even in hand-drawn form, but I have to say, something as simple as the addition of fur ramps that up exponentially. It also doesn't hurt that Chris Sanders returned as the voice of Stitch, giving us a nostalgic dose of the 626 we all know and love. On the con side, the biggest issue has got to be the character changes. Honestly, this is something I could expand to 3 or 4 separate cons, but I'll condense them into just one and hit only the key points. First off, Lilo is far less weird or isolated here, significantly impacting her relationship with both Stitch and Nani. The addition of neighbor Tutu changes this a lot as well, plus the character dynamics and story importance of both David and Cobra Bubbles are way off. But the biggest problem here is the complete removal of Gantu and the misguided character changes made to Jumba. Con number 2 is the thematic shift. So this is slightly less egregious, and something that some people may even like. But this remake is much less about Ohana than the original film. That aspect is certainly still there, but that original core idea of 2 weird, lonely misfits searching for belonging and finding each other is no longer the prominent emotional theme. Instead, it's swapped for what was kind of a tertiary theme in the original: reassurance that occasionally doing bad things doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It's fine, but feels like a much more superficial read of the story and these characters. The third con is the pacing. One of my longtime criticisms of the animated film is how frenetic it feels, but I've gotta say, watching these movies back to back makes that first film feel fleshed out and expertly edited. I have no idea why, but the first act of this film is on hyperdrive. It speeds through the greatest hits moments of the first 30 minutes of the original in about 8 minutes, which significantly hampers the introduction of all of its characters. Then, later on, other elements of the plot feel like they drag, because they don't have the necessary heartfelt emotional oomph behind them. It still feels frenetic, just without the energy or heart to propel it from one story beat to the next. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Lilo and Stitch, or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Lilo and Stitch 2.5 out of 5 paws. It's a very middling live-action remake. Stitch is certainly cute, and the aspects of the story and characters that it draws from the animated original are still strong, but this movie features many baffling changes, mostly character-based, that significantly change the thematic focus and dynamics of the story for the worse. This film's fine when viewed as a purely standalone entity, but as a remake, it's comparatively rough, and will have a hard time finding a place in any fan's ohana. I would recommend Lilo and Stitch to people who have a history of enjoying the Disney live-action remakes. It sticks pretty close to the basic story outline of the original film, but does change a few things up with seemingly little reason. It also does introduce a few interesting new ideas, but leaves them largely unexplored. If you weren't a big fan of the original's Ohana-centric focus, this remake does switch up the core themes a bit, but kind of downplays many of the original's best elements in the process. I think people who have never seen the animated film will have a better time with this one than pre-existing fans will, but I think most of those newcomers would still enjoy the animated film far more, so I'd nudge just about everybody in that direction over this live-action route. If you liked Lilo and Stitch, I would recommend Sonic the Hedgehog. This is another live-action film featuring a surprisingly cute, blue, furry CG alien interacting with humans in the real world. Rather than a destructive genetic experiment, this tale of found family focuses on the familiar Speedy Hedgehog, as he too tries to evade capture. If you'd like another film directed by Dean Fleischer Camp, you've gotta check out Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. This bizarre mockumentary blends live action and stop-motion animation to tell the funny but moving story of an anthropomorphic seashell searching for his family, touching on a number of poignant and heartwarming themes along the way. And if you liked any of the characters or story in this remake, I'd be remiss not to recommend the animated Lilo and Stitch. I usually avoid making recommendations like this because it's kind of obvious, but it seems like there are a number of people who've never seen the original film, or haven't rewatched it in 20 plus years. So I think it's a worthwhile recommendation, given its far superior handling of character and themes. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Lilo and Stitch? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, do you prefer remakes that stick fairly close to the original, or ones that significantly change things up? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.